This is Look West, a podcast from California's Assembly Democrats.
November 1st, 2019 marked the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment in California. California became the sixth state where women could vote equally with men, 9 years before the 19th Amendment was ratified by the United States. The 19th Amendment made it law that all women in America would be allowed to vote in elections.
Well, but not really. Women at the time were still faced with several barriers. In California, there were land ownership requirements, poll taxes, literacy tests, and the most obvious, ethnicity and racial limits. The right to vote in 1919 was secured for wealthy white women.
Women of color had to split their energy and efforts between gender equality and racial equality fights. Although California would like to see itself as better than the Jim Crow South, we had our own barriers to voting for our non-white population. This is Cristina Cano.
And this is Bella Romero with Look West. Our host, Assemblymember Dr. Shirley Weber, and guest, Dr. Huma Ahmed-Ghosh, share with us their knowledge on the history of voting rights in California for the last 100 years, how California is leading the nation on lowering barriers to voting, as well as their own stories fighting for equitable representation.
Hi, I'm Dr. Shirley Weber, and I'm an Assembly member representing California's 79th Assembly District, and this is Look West. I should also indicate that was once a professor at San Diego State University for 40 years, and so this is an extremely important topic to me as we talk about women in history. We're here to talk about the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment here in California. My guest is really not just the professor in the Department of Women's Studies at San Diego State, Dr. Huma Ahmed-Ghosh, but she's also a friend, and we've traveled together, and so I know her passion for women, her passion for history, and I'm honored to have her here with me today. She is a published researcher internationally, recognized for her scholarship on Muslim women in South Asia and the diaspora. She works with and studies women groups involved in peace activism, regional cooperation, and economic development of women. Welcome, Huma. It's so good to have you here.
Well, it is entirely my pleasure, and thanks for making me sound so good. But it is a real honor to be with you in this room today. So as the 100th year of the suffrage rights are coming together, we want to talk about some specifically California, but of course it's going to be difficult to talk about California without talking about the origins of the whole debate and the struggle for rights. And I want to say it out front how sexist and racist it was, because there's no point beating around the bush on that one. And so even though we had the 19th Amendment, it was not necessary that everybody did get the right to vote. So maybe we can talk about that, and also specifically with California about temperance and what, it did to the women's vote.
Well, it's interesting that, because normally when you study about women's right to vote and the 100th anniversary of it, the interesting thing is that when in the context of all the things happening in the United States, this was obviously one of the most important things that was happening for women at the time. But if we ask ourselves what was going on with African American women, we discovered that 1919 was the Red Summer of 1919, where there were lots of assaults and attacks on African Americans. They call it the Red Summer because so much blood was shed that it was like a red river going on. African Americans had come back from the war and had come back with the thought that they would be welcomed and into the United States as full citizens, only to discover once again they were going to be discriminated against. And so you had a lot of things going on. You had all of the movements with the NAACP and the various organizations being developed at that time. You had Marcus Garvey and the nationalist movement in the United States at that time. And so what happened in 1919 was really a surge of African-American activism because of the fact that they had fought in the war, World War I, felt that coming home they would be welcomed back into the United States as full citizens, only to have men lynched in their uniforms in the South. And so this was quite a blow that was there. So there were women involved in the women's movement, but when you start talking about priorities and where do you put your energy and efforts, you have a lot of them very involved in the lynching movement and the efforts to try to create some opportunity in communities that would being snatched away once folks came back from the war. So it was an interesting time when you study 1919 in terms of activism.
Yeah, you're really right, and I think you hit the nail on the head by talking about citizenship, because that was the crux of the whole divide and debates on women's suffrage movement. And so interestingly, citizenship, which formed the core of the movement and for women's rights, starting from the mid-1800s, in California it was interesting because it was the temperance movement, which was started by white elite Protestant women who also joined the bandwagon of the suffrage movement because they thought if they got the right to vote. And they were interestingly defining citizenship in terms of their morality.
Yes.
And moral honor, and as white women, how they were responsible for the moral womanhood of the nation. And the reason I bring this up, because not only was it specific to California, it was the larger debate when the white women did not want blacks or black men to get the vote because they did not see them as citizens.
Yes.
And so in the whole struggle leading up to 1920 with the 19th Amendment, we see that over a period of 30 to 40 years, they were trying to deny minorities, as we'd call them today, their rights, because the main thing was they did not see them, as one of them stated, as even evolved enough to be citizens.
Yes.
And so with this morality issue, the white elite women, especially the Protestants, saw themselves as being the gateway to morality of the USA, and therefore kept other women and men of color out of the issue, and which was interesting because many men, of course, objected to them, as well as women in Southern California, because other women's groups said, no, that's a real moral issue. We don't want to bring that in as a demand for rights, because we want to be citizens as contributing citizens, because citizenship was defined mainly in terms of white men who had jobs and who were educated. And so it ruled out all the others. So that's interesting. And then so it really what you were saying about men, black men, or the community even looking for rights as citizens was so problematic and deliberately denied that it affected the whole suffragist movement.
Yeah, and California has we have a tendency to think of California as being this other place that was not like the South, it was not like the East, that this was this new territory that didn't have limitations. And so African Americans, even who moved from the South to California, assumed that there would be a different kind of life for them. And in some ways it was, because of the fact that it was a larger area, geographical area, and people could kind of move around a bit, and the segregation was not as apparent. In other words, they didn't have big signs of water fountains, the colored and the white and so forth and so on. Yet we had laws that basically made that a reality. In other words,
in the South,
we had laws in California that actually made a segregation a reality because of the housing patterns and the laws against selling property to different individuals, limits as to how many people of color you could have in any particular activity, ownership, who owns land, and having these requirements that you have to own land, as well as who you could sell your land to. A lot of those things are still written in people's documents, ownership documents that are there. They're no longer legal in California. They can't be enforced, but they give us an insight into how much discrimination there was. And even, moving up into beyond that period, when we start talking about real segregation, we always talk about that which is law de jure, but we also talked about de facto, which means, in essence, that is the fact of the matter, that we had segregated schools and segregated places for people to live and those kinds of things. And so those barriers were there. California had poll taxes at some point where people had to pay to vote, those kinds of things. So there were a number of barriers that existed. The difference, I could say, in California was that because people who coming from the South didn't feel as great amount of oversight as they had in living in the South, because they lived close together, so they didn't see the fact that you could not go to a certain school and you'd pass by a white school to get to a black school or vice versa, because the housing patterns were such that there was discrimination in housing. So if you went to the school in your neighborhood, it was going to be black because the neighborhood was black.
Yeah.
And so we had the same kind of challenges that were there, and I think African Americans realized in this whole process of getting the vote, women getting the vote, that it would probably have little impact upon them. Because when the original vote was given, quote unquote, at the end of slavery, it did not impact women, but it also in the South didn't impact African Americans either because of the barriers.
Yeah, exactly. It didn't impact the men either.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. They didn't get the right to vote.
Yeah, even though it was the 14th and 15th Amendment that gave them rights after a big, as I said earlier, racist and sexist struggle by the white women suffragists who were the leaders of the movement. It did not, because of all the restrictions, as you say. But how far has it got the women?
And, well, it's a real question, because and I sometimes agonize over that, because I think of how much energy, how much resources we put into not only the right to vote, but the whole issue of women's rights and ERA and trying to get that passed and the barriers to that.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
you think most of us think that it passed and it's not. And so there are a lot of things that happen that keep indicating in some way that women's rights and the whole issue of voting is still very tempered by the domination of males and sexism that's there. I was in the last election, I was just, as most of us were, blown away over the fact that the reason why Hillary Clinton didn't win was women.
Yes.
That shocked the heck out of most of us, because we kind of live in a liberal bubble, I think, to a certain extent, and totally unaware of the fact that women have difficulty voting for women.
Yeah.
And so men had difficulty giving women the vote, because they thought, well, if these women got the right to vote, they will take over the world.
Yeah.
And what we have seen is that they haven't taken over the world in the United States. And the loss of the last election, because women didn't vote for a woman, that was just mind-boggling. It would be comparable to Obama losing because black people wouldn't vote for him. It's just unbelievable.
Shirley, maybe 12 or 13 years ago, I'm reminded of a conversation with you in the hallways of the third floor in Arts and Letters at San Diego State University. It was the primaries with Obama and Hillary Clinton. And it was very, very early, and people thought this was Hillary's chance.
Yes.
And you had this, the wicked smile that you have sometimes, and you said no. You were one of the very few who said no, and you said, they won't vote for a white woman. The white men won't vote for a white woman because it'll challenge their power.
Yes.
And it's like sitting at the dining table and your wife is the president. I said, and then I continued to quote you till it became really clear that Obama...
Well, it was shocking. It was.
But you're right.
And I thought we had gotten beyond that. At least enough. I thought we'd gotten far enough beyond it. Especially given her opposition. I just thought we had finally gotten to this point that we opened the door and an African-American male walked in and the world didn't end.
Yeah.
In fact, it may have gotten better, okay? Right. Everybody thought, if he becomes president, we all going to hell in a handbasket, and it didn't. So it didn't. That didn't happen. In fact, he was our scandalous president, okay? Thank God. But
scandal-less is what she means.
Scandal-less, yes. We did not have scandals. And so the thing so as a result of that, so you figure, okay, he laid a good groundwork for the future, for people to be open. And so when she comes along the second time and people find minor flaws and this and that, and she doesn't win. I mean, she wins a popular vote. We know that, but all the other stuff. So, but it was mind-boggling. And then when they disaggregated the data and discovered that the people who didn't vote for her were white women. Oh my God! You say to yourself, how long?
So
how long?
It's interesting because 100 years later, we're almost repeating the struggle and the patterns because, again, the black man got the vote before the white woman.
Yes.
Even though the white women were wives and leaders of the elite group, their own men were not supporting them.
Yes.
Again, and it's interesting because even when I was looking at some data on California, it was very interesting how many there were anti-suffragist women who were the elite women. So, frankly, for me as an outsider, sometimes I like to pretend I'm an outsider since I came from India, but I've been here 30 plus years. My sense in the 38 years that I have lived in the US is that race continues for me to be the biggest issue that we need to wrestle with. I, for some reason, feel that gender is not that big as race. When I look around what has been going on in this country for 30 plus years, but when it has come to the polls,
yes,
it is the women. So it really makes you wonder what is really going on, and maybe our departments of women's studies, gender studies, or even feminists living in a bubble.
Yeah. And I think that's
because they are white and elite, maybe they think they have the privilege of class and race. I don't know what it is. But Shirley, what would you think of the works and efforts of Shirley Chisholm, for example?
Well, Shirley Chisholm, was
flash in the pan, or did it have a trickle down kind of?
Well, I think it has had. One of the things that's been interesting, and I sometimes don't think people thoroughly understand either Shirley Chisholm or black women or whatever it is. Even way back, I was telling someone recently with Sojourner Truth and Ain't I a Woman?
Yeah.
Most people think that, misunderstand that as a feminist thing. And basically she was saying, I am never treated like a woman.
Yeah.
I am not treated like a woman. And I think that is true even for me as an elected official.
You feel that?
Oh, yes, most definitely.
Really?
The assumption is that we can work hard and we can carry the burden. Nobody seems to basically soften their language for me. I mean, if I'm going to be attacked by the police, they're going to come after me as much as they possibly can, where they may feel like as a woman that she couldn't carry this burden.
Yeah.
When we look at the woman in Atlanta, the mayor there, who ran for governor,
Governor, yeah.
Yes, I mean, we look at her and what we see in her is strength and power, and so we don't have the same kind of reality that's there. And so when we start thinking about, what did Shirley Chisholm do? Shirley Chisholm, her theme was, unbought and unbossed. I mean, and she was. And she raised the basically the consciousness with regards to black women. And black women, whether it's Maxine Waters, and you look at the current president, he attacks these black women and women of color without regard, but he pays homage to those who are thin and who are blonde and who are Nordic looking, because that's what he sees as an important piece in his life. And so we women of color have always been these fighters, and I think that's one of the reasons why folks can depend on us, whether it's a minister in the church or whether it's a politician or whatever, because those women are solid. I was laughing because back when I was doing some work on the O.J. Simpson trial, and when O.J. Simpson's trial, when you look at it, the majority of the people in that trial were black women. And Johnny Cochran knew that if he got to those black women and they understood what was going on, that there would be nobody who could change their mind, because black women, when they make up their mind, that's the end of it, and they are not wishy-washy. And most of those women on that jury, one of them was my friend, were black women, and whites were totally unaware in the jury pool. But Johnny Cochran understood that black women are strong, they fight, and they can hold their opinion, and they're not concerned about all these other things with regards to whether or not somebody's going to be impressed by them. So when we begin to look at it, and so black women still to this day, if you look at the women in the legislature, whether it's the Holly Mitchells and Burke and others, we are a cadre of very strong women who vote very strong in the assembly, and the same is true with those in Washington. When we think of California's legislators, we think of Maxine Waters immediately.
And I want to take off from what you're just saying is because of the black women lobby, if one wants to call it, because there was another very interesting thing which again brings out the race and gender issue in the white feminist movement or women's movement, and that was that of Anita Hill.
Yes.
And the white women appropriated her and wanted to use only the feminist lens.
Right.
And not bring in the race issue or the black community, really, at some level, or the black feminists. And it backfired.
Yes. Yeah.
And so you're very right about this lobby of the black women that
and
they have to be wary of.
We're ever conscious of it, whether it's dealing with important issues at the Capitol or whether it's the women's organization, the caucus. We have a tendency to, black women have a tendency to kind of look back and observe because oftentimes the things they're fighting about or they're discussing are things we did 15, 20 years ago.
I know.
We have had to fight not only the woman's battle, but we've also had to fight the male battle.
And the race battle, that is the whole thing. We say
so
that,
the double oppression is there. And so women are black women of color, particularly African American women, are pretty much aware of that.
Yeah.
It was interesting to me. I remember when I became a member of the school board, one of my colleagues who was white was getting a divorce. And the first thing she did in getting a divorce was to change her registration from a Republican to a Democrat.
Okay.
And
I thought, a divorce to do that. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting. And I said, well, why were you a Republican? She says, well, my husband would not allow me to be anything but a Republican. So for peace in the family for 30 years, she registered as a Republican, but voted her conscience. Now, I thought that was so bizarre because there would be no way in the world my father could tell my mother, and my father worked every day and my mother was a housemaker, that she had to register a certain particular way or that he was going to control her vote. That just wasn't going to happen in my family's situation. And my father was the breadwinner, quote unquote. But the idea that you could tell a black woman that she could not register to vote how she wanted to register to vote was very bizarre to me. And I said, she did this for 30 years to make peace with this husband.
Which didn't work out. She was on the wrong track.
She was on the wrong track from the very beginning. And so I thought to myself, oh my God,
that is
voting
the sad part.
Is the sad part is, and voting is so important and affects people's lives and what they do that you would basically allow someone to own your vote. Very bizarre.
I have used in my teaching and research, theoretically, when you have to frame scholarly articles, even though you just want to speak your mind, is that I have used theories of that talk about black women because for Muslim women too, it's similar kinds of dilemmas. Do you sort of protect the men in your community who are seen as terrorists, and at the same time the clergy in Islam or amongst Muslim communities want women to become conservative again. And so these dilemmas are hard to deal with and wrestle with. And I feel that when I look at the literature on the suffragist movement, definitely black women were pushed a lot when, especially the insistence on having the black man get his vote before all women and even white women split and became a dilemma for black women and who to support. And it was interesting, and rightfully they supported the vote for the black man because they felt that at least it would give them some power
in their families.
In the families and all of that. So that was interesting. But what became very disappointing was then when the 19th Amendment was passed, that black women specifically, who were seen as citizens, by the way, unlike Native Americans, interestingly, and Asians, for them the struggle for citizenship was very extended, where the black women were not able to vote. And in California specifically, we find that even though the earliest discussions in the 1800s about women's suffrages were coming from Native American examples of the Iroquois and the other groups, I mean, even Stanton and all talk about it, but they were not seen as citizens, and neither were the Asians and the Asian Americans for the longest time, and so therefore did not have a right to vote. But when black women did have the right, there were so many obstacles that it took about 40, 50 years for them to vote. So I have a question now that you are up there in Sacramento. And what do you see the future? Now we're in a crucial position again.
Yes.
Next year is a big year. And again, I think I am going into it very, very hopeful. But I was hopeful last time too.
Yeah, I was hopeful last time too.
Yeah.
I think the key, particularly for women, and I think African Americans and Latinos and others recognize it, that central to our future and trying to get things done is going to be the education of our children, to make sure that they don't have the same. And we haven't done that with women yet. We have not penetrated the K-12.
Yeah.
We've kept it at the more intellectual level. We've kept it at that level, but we have not begun to realize that we have to change the ideas and attitudes of our children from the time they're born through all of their schooling that's there, to really begin to talk about it. Because like I said, I was shocked when I discovered that. And then when I go around the world and I see these women who are running the world, who are in charge of countries and what have you, and I'm thinking, we are supposed to be this quote unquote the progressive individuals, yet we have not been progressive. California's never had a female governor. We had one who ran
I'm looking
before.
at the list of governors while you're talking.
We've never had a female governor. So when you start asking those questions, I mean, and our delegation of women, we have women who are in the delegation in Congress, but we were seeing a decline in women running for the assembly, and so the Women's Caucus had to get busy and basically try to increase the numbers, and we've seen the increase of women now coming in. So I think all of that's going to happen. We have I serve on the elections committee, and I think I've been on it for the last 7 years, and election and redistricting. And I think the important thing is that we're opening up all kinds of avenues, because we're realizing that we have to provide the opportunity to vote in so many different ways, so that we'll have a longer period for people to vote. They won't have to be that one day, one experience. We see that is happening here will be happening in California. We're increasing the number of people who can vote by mail. We are increasing the opportunity to register to vote online, as well as making it possible for kids in high school to register to vote in advance of their opportunity to vote. So I think there are a lot of things that are pushing, and in the last election we saw a great turnout of people voting. So we're trying to make it the kind of thing that everyone does. And that we are opening these voting centers instead of just polling booths, where people can go in libraries and wherever and drop it off with this mass list that will be able to identify you wherever you are in California, so that you don't have to run home to vote. You can vote if you're in La Jolla. You can go vote even though you live in Southeast San Diego. So I think we've done a lot. I don't know if we've done enough. We will only determine that if someone tells us that there was a barrier to them voting, and this is why they didn't vote. But I think giving the time frame, the vote by mail, the increasing the what they call the voting centers and all that other stuff, I think we will get to those who want to vote, and we have to make sure that we give them something to vote for.
And we are seeing a rapid increase in elected officials. I think San Diego is an amazing city. I think maybe the maximum number are coming from San Diego, and definitely a spike in Latinas. So elected officials from the state are increased. A lot of women are. And I think many ethnic niches are also prioritizing their communities to vote, and there is education going on within the communities. And I see that when I work, for example, with the refugees in El Cajon, there's a push to, have the ballot, have Arabic on the ballot too,
Exactly.
And so that, and then the Latino communities are pushing for it. So there is a strong sense, and in San Diego also a very strong connection of many departments with communities. Women's Studies department is very active in education, and we have somebody who's also on the who's a delegate.
Right.
So I think for women and minorities, the city is working very hard and seeing it in action, like Run Women Run and all of that. And the elected officials are there.
And we've all, and of course, women need to have a major registration of women. This time in California, and we have between now and we have the March election coming up, but then after that we have the big November election. So we have a lot of opportunity to register people to vote, and we should make sure that every person is registered to vote.
I mean, it's a really interesting year, because not only is it 100 years of the suffragist movement, but it may be one of the most crucial elections in the history of U.S.
Yeah.
Thanks to Dr. Weber and Dr. Ahmed-Ghosh. I'm Christina Cano.
And I'm Bella Romero. Thanks for listening to Look West.
The Look West podcast is produced by the California Assembly Democrats. Please subscribe and rate this show wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And when you think of California and politics, remember to look west.